Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time for this seminar on our project concerning the Belgian economic potential of the industry of defense and security, also known as the BAPITS project. We will present you today some key aspects of the project output that we think might be interesting for the wider audience, such as you. Of course, we cannot cover everything in this short presentation, so we do invite you to look at the final output for more details. All of the output will be uploaded on the geoeconomicsgroup.be website. So, first, we'll give a short introduction of the background to the project and how it relates to the Belgian defense industry and research strategy. Then I will present some insights on the mapping portion of the research, and my colleague Grit will then present key insights of the output from the legal research that was conducted on the project. And finally, we will open the floor to questions. What is the BAPIS project, and how does it relate to the DIGS? The DIGS is a 1.8 billion euro supporting measure for the Belgian defense technological industrial base, primarily to secure the Belgian essential security interest. Among its objectives to do so are supporting the Belgian legal entities in multinational cooperation programs, as they can then more effectively enter existing and emerging value chains and participate in future capability development. Secondly, to ensure security of supply and a national edge where deemed necessary, and to ensure Belgian legal entities in the Belgian defense technological industrial base contribute to the knowledge base and research and development. The Belgian Defense Industry and Research Strategy includes the establishment of a steering committee that must formulate policy recommendations to the authorities. These recommendations concern, among others, the evolution of priority domains and corresponding levels of ambitions in those domains, with those priority domains being identified on the basis of the listed criteria on the slide. So how does the BAPITS project factor in that? The BAPITS project focuses on providing input for some key open points of the DIRS, namely what is the Belgian defense technological and industrial base, and how can it be supported? To answer this, the key objectives of the project are firstly to map the Belgian defense technological industrial base, as well as develop a database that can then be used for further analysis. And secondly, to develop a policy toolkit and manual for support for the Belgian defense technological industrial base in compliance with the stipulations of EU law. So, who is funding the BAPITS project and why? The BAPITS project is being funded by BELSPO, the Belgian Science Policy Office, and by the Royal Higher Institute of Defense. BELSPO funds this from its Pillar 3 in the BRAIN program, which focuses on funding scientific research to support the competencies, strategic orientations, and policies of the federal state, such as, for instance, the Belgian Defense Industry and Research Strategy is. And the Royal Higher Institute for Defense, they set aside a some post-project funds for dissemination and also for further development of the database. Now that I've outlined the context behind the project, and I'll provide some more insights on the mapping. First, I'll run through what we exactly mean by the defense technological industrial base concept, how we understand it. Then secondly, how we mapped and developed the database. Then provide a high-level overview of the mapping. And lastly, some short insights on the EU ecosystem by looking at an example of the EDF and the precursor programs. First, and let's start with what we mean exactly when we refer to the term Belgian Defense Technological and Industrial Base. This is based on the working paper output, the defining and delimiting the Belgian Defense Technological Industrial Base based on a comparative case study analysis. And for more information, you can also look at the preliminary findings of an earlier BAPIS report. Based on our analysis of the case studies, we derived that the general understanding of the DTIP concept that refers to domestic sources that provide goods, services, and technologies required by armed forces to fulfill their responsibilities, either directly or by being part of the value chain. So this means that any good, service, or technology required by the armed forces, whether it's directly procured, purchased, or indirectly required as an input in the value chain, that they can be included. So contrary to the general understanding of the defense market or the defense equipment market concept, a product does not necessarily need to be intended or designed or adapted for military use to be considered part of the DTIP. So while in most cases that does overlap with products offered in the defense market, also products designed and intended for security use or critical materials and common goods for security of supply are essential also to fulfill the requirements of the armed forces and are included under the DTIP concept. So while that is the general understanding that is derived, there are wide differences in the use of the concept. Some just use it similarly as the defense industry or the defense sector. Others employ this concept as well. But what is then the potential DTIP? Potential DTIP refers to domestic sources that have the potential to provide. That is, they have the technological innovation capabilities and or the industrial capacity to contribute, but they do not do so at the moment. Or they currently do provide good services and technologies, but they have the potential to increase that impact. Potential, of course, is context dependent. So in a stable threat environment, it can be limited to maximizing dual use R&D spillovers, while in wartime, the potential concerns the wider industrial base that could be called upon to produce a wide range of required material for the war effort. For instance, think of a commercial truck maker that shifts to producing armored vehicles, or a commercial clothing manufacturer that produces textiles for the armed forces. Similarly then, the technological base, universities and research and technology organizations, they could be called upon to churn out innovations for that war effort. So to maintain a functional data set, we only include potential in our mapping of the legal entities that are currently provide those products or supplies to the armed forces, but that do have the potential to increase their impact. Now that we understand the scope of what is being mapped, I can explain more about the mapping and development of the database. This continues on the prior work that was done by Akostrat, the National Arms Directorate, and the Federal Public Service Economy. So we continue that cooperation and align with the parties on content and functionality. For the mapping, we derived the list of legal entities from the following key sources. First, from the defense and security procurement contracts. Secondly, from the EU-NATO Belgian defense R&D programs, such as from the European Defense Fund and its precursor programs, from the European Defense Industrial Development Program, the preparatory action for defense research and the defense pilot projects, but then also the EDA projects, EDIRPA, ASAP, DEFRA, projects at the Royal Military Academy and the Royal Air Institute for defense, and also others such as NATO's DIANA and the NATO Investment Fund. Then third, legal entities already listed in the database of the Belgian armaments industry, from defense and security relevant business associations such as Skywin, FLAC, PSDI, Polmecatech, Belgospace, and so on. From existing reports such as from the Flemish Peace Institute, DG Home's list of the EU security market, CERTIDER, defense relevant NASIC codes, although this is quite limited. The nomenclature for activities employed in the EU and therefore also by Belgium, the Belgian version, are quite limited in their regard to detailing codes that are defense related. So there's only a limited amount of codes. So if a legal entity does not have that as their primary or secondary activity, they will not be included in the NASIC codes. And we see a lot of the entities that we mapped in the list, they do not correspond with any defense related NASIC code. Then we derived companies from LinkedIn by looking at whether they self-identified as being in a category that is defense or security related. So you can do this by looking at the self-assigned LinkedIn sector. So LinkedIn has a couple of sectors or industries that they self-define that you can choose as a company. And then you can filter for that, check via their about or via their website if they mention defense and go into more detail in their website for their products to see if it is relevant or not. Then we also look at newspaper articles, of course, and other open source to see if they have defense relevant activities. And lastly, we look at the business days and events such as, for instance, Eurosatory. So all of this feeds, this creates a list of legal entities. We derive that from these sources, and that feeds into the DTIF main file that we can then use for further analysis and linking to other data. To maintain a cleaner management of the data, we plug the main file together with other data in a Power BI structure. So here I've provided a simplified overview. For more details, you can refer to the backup slides. So that main file has key data that requires manual updating, such as domain, captech. Every time you add a new legal entity to the list, you have to update this manually. But this other data can be extracted and processed and then linked via common identifiers with that main file. The easiest way to do that is within a Power BI structure. And there's also other advantages to doing so, which I will explain in the next slide. So the main sources that we employ for linking are the Crossroad Bank of Enterprises of Belgium, so open data, the Belfirst or Orbis, which does require that you have a subscription and in some cases full access rights to extract. The National Bank of Belgium, which also has open access data options, and then files that we developed ourselves during the Babies project that we link with the main file. So here's a quick example of why using Power BI is preferred, at the very least for the user interface. Not only is the data cleaner to manage and less prone to errors in the linking, the mapping functions, as you can see at the left, and also the drill down functions, which you can see on the bottom right image, they work more intuitively than in Excel. At the same time, you can also, once all of this data is linked in the Power BI structure, you can download it again directly to Excel with all of those links made, and there you don't have the problem like in Excel where the links do not work properly because it is using the Power BI linking to analyze the data. So for the long term, the database can still be expanded. There's a couple of steps that can be followed. So for our project, we focused on steps 1 and 2. So setting up that manual DTIP Excel file with the general data parameters. And then secondly, to make a cleaner structure by setting up a manual DTIP database and UI in Power BI. Now that's still a manual structure since you need to extract those files in the backend in a SharePoint, and you can refresh the data, and if you download everything in the same manner, there are no issues, but it's still prone to errors. So it is preferred in the future to automate this by using APIs to call in that data via the common identifiers. So the data sets that we employ, they do have those common identifiers that is possible. The APIs, they just require access rights to some of the data sources that we employed. It can then also, for instance, be for an ad hoc analysis, be integrated with the global defense supplier base for Belgian defense. So that refers to essentially all the suppliers to Belgian defense, not just from Belgium. That can be done to make a deeper analysis of the sourcing of Belgian defense. So then down the line, if there are secure options available, there is also AI-supported predictive analysis. Of course, Power BI, so what is currently set up, already has AI analysis. It's not AI by any linking to the web. It's automatically integrated. But this is just with data that you provide. It's analyzed after the fact, it's not a predictive analysis. Based on the limitations of the Belgian DTIP and the mapping sources described before, we derived 780 separate legal entities, with in total 15,038 establishment units for all their economic activities. They have a turnover of 50 billion euros, employment of around 104K, and represent a value added of 17 billion euros. Of course, what interests us is the impact for the defense relevant activities. So to estimate the proportion of DTIP-related activities, we first used proportions from a comparable mapping study done in the Netherlands, and we did that for several reasons. Although there are some differences, of course, between the Netherlands and Belgium in the industrial fabric of the countries, the Netherlands is the most comparative neighboring country concerning the defense technological industrial base, with both the Netherlands and Belgium focusing on specialized niche goods and services, as opposed to, for instance, France, Germany, and the UK that have an industrial infrastructure and financial capacity to drive really large weapon system development and production programs. Also due to the Benelux, but also because there is defense cooperation between the Netherlands and Belgium in certain aspects, such as maritime, we have a more integrated industrial ties and interconnected economies. Therefore, it's interesting to use the Netherlands as the first basis to make an analysis, since they have done a similar study before. So based on those proportions that we derived from the study from the Netherlands, we initially estimated a turnover for Belgium of defense-related activities of about 5.3 billion euros, direct employment of 12.9K, and about 1.9 billion value added. Now, based on the data that we did have on the defense-related, the proportion of defense-related activities for certain companies, we made data inferences based on those data inputs and employed the allocated sector and whether the entity is part of a defense-relevant association to infer the estimations on the proportions. Although that is a common employed data inference method in data analysis, given we had only about 100 data points, there is a margin of error which can affect the representability. So that means those findings do need to be reassessed. Based on this data, we estimate that the Belgian TTIP has a defense-related impact of about 5.9 billion in turnover, 19.5K for employment, and 2.5 billion for gross value added. So currently there is a survey running for 2022 to 2024 data for the impact analysis, which we can employ to further make correcter estimations on these values for 2023 data. Currently, this survey has about 100 responses, providing us about 200 data points, meaning that we significantly decrease that margin of error for our data inferences. So here's a quick snippet of the ongoing impact survey for the 2022 to 2024 data. We sent this to all the legal entities that we have listed in the database currently. About a week or so after they fully complete the survey questions, they receive access to this dashboard that already gives them a few insights as to motivate for them to take the survey to receive some value as well for their time. And for instance, you can see that based on the answers of the participants in the survey, that you see a notable increase, especially from 2023 to 2024 for the defense-related revenue of the participants. Of course, I do have to note that this is not; these are not weighted averages. So, for instance, if a large company says that their defense-related revenue, the percentage of the defense-related revenue is 40%, and a smaller company says 5%, then of course that percentage for the larger company weighs heavier than for the smaller company. So, to make a proper analysis, this still has to be weighted for the actual revenue size per company. So if you are a defense, security, or dual use related company, or your research and technology organization or university active in defense, then you can take this survey by following the QR code to the right or by following the link that is provided. So as said, you should receive access to the survey dashboard about 1 week after you have taken it. So while I'm at it, I'll also take the time to promote our final event that will take place on the 17th of December, where the final impact analysis will be presented based also on these survey insights. So some key points that will be presented, as we'll have more time to do so, as opposed to in this presentation: an updated impact analysis of the defense-related turnover GVA, the full-time equivalent of the employment, and so on, strengths and weaknesses, the ownership and control of the legal entities in the list, the whether they are part of a defense and security related association and what the gaps are. Then the foreign subsidiary exposure of the key Belgian defense companies. Some more details on the insights of the EU ecosystem and also information on the export of strategic goods versus how other EU member states are doing, and more. I don't have the time to delve into all the details information here, so you should come to the event if you have the time available, but let me just give you a little bit of a extra insight via the map of the mapping. We see on the map the sizing of the companies colored. So for large cap, for instance, blue; for mid caps, orange. And then the size of the circle represents the defense related revenue that is calculated based on the data inferences and the estimations. The mid caps, about 12% of the mapped entities, they represent the bulk of the estimated impact for the defense-related activities. So they represent about 65% of the turnover and 58% of the full-time equivalent employment. The micro-sized entities, which are 44% of the mapped entities, their estimated impact in terms of turnover, gross value added, or employment is actually quite limited. And then Flanders, they have the most entities, 52% of the mapping, but they have the lowest estimated defense-related impact per entity of all the regions. So you'll note, of course, that there is a quite a severe allocation of companies around Brussels and environment. Of course, these companies are skewed to Brussels as the mapping is based on the this map is based on the head office location. So if we would look at this instead per establishment unit, you'd see that about 45% of the mapping is in Flanders, 44% is Wallonia, and only 11% is in Brussels, whereas currently a lot of those companies are mapped in Brussels. For the final representation of the impact analysis, these, if they have an establishment unit is more prominent in another region, they will be mapped to that region according to the social security data that indicates what the most prominent establishment unit is or not. Now we need to request the access for the social security data to do so, the limited data, or access to scrape the information from the website. And lastly, before handing over to Griep, I'll give some quick insights on the how the Belgian Defence Technological Industrial Base is doing within the EU ecosystem based on the EDF and precursor analysis we did. So this is a ongoing working paper for a project output, the Belgium within the European defense ecosystem. And for this, we also developed a EDF and precursor data set, as this is not just cannot be extracted as is from European sources. So you have to do some data meddling to set this up. And this is based initially on a working paper / presentation presented at the Bordeaux Defense Working Group. So within the European defense ecosystem working paper, we looked at the EDF and its precursor programs as a proxy to assess the comparative success for Belgium in the competitive portion of the EU comparative cooperative defense ecosystem, and how that aligns to Belgian specific characteristics. So we looked at the EDF 22 to 21 data, the European Defense Industrial Development Program, the preparatory action for defense research, and the pilot project. So the EDF 2023 call results, they have been published somewhere in May, but the data per entity is not yet available on CEDIA at the time that we developed the data set. So this can be updated once that becomes available. So we look at the competitive portion, so that excludes the non-competitive direct awards, such as Male Airpas and ESOR, the framework partnership, such as resilience, and the support actions. So for the non-competitive direct awards, the received contributions per entity are also not publicly available, as for instance in the financial transparency system of the EU, from which you can get some of the data. There's only a bulk sum transfer to OCCAR, to the OCCAR organization that manages the program, but there's not a detailed breakdown of which companies receives what, and it's not publicly available to our, as far as we know, according to our research. So what is the presence of the Belgian Defense Technological and Industrial Base in the EDF and the precursor programs? So there are 44 legal entities that take part, when you count them distinctly, and they have taken part in total 89 times in 59 projects. So that gives them an average participation rate of 1.5 per project that they took part in. So in total, these Belgian legal entities, they received about 85 million in EU contributions for taking part in those projects. Must be noted though that those values are based on the members of the consortium, so sub-suppliers that are involved in the projects throughout the contracts with the members. They are not included in that information, as that's not published for all the projects, and when it is done, it's only partial. So how does Belgium compare to the other member states, or rather the Belgian legal entities? As you can see on the figure, compared to the other participating country, Belgium finds itself in the 7th position for overall received EU contributions and total participations of Belgian legal entities. Some direct noticeable insights are that the Netherlands has a higher number of participation, but receives less total EU contributions than Belgium, indicating that many participation of Dutch legal entities play a relatively smaller role. Also interesting is that Eastern European countries overall trend to the lower end of the distribution, and that France clearly surpasses the rest in terms of both received EU contributions and participations. So at first glance, one may argue that that last point supports the often heard critique in defense, and especially defense industry circles, that France receives disproportionate support from the EU funds, the EDF. However, those absolute values on its own should not be interpreted as implying that France, or rather French legal entities, receive too much EU funding. For that, you have to look at received contributions relative to a or applicable basis, such as a burden sharing indicator that provides a relative analysis. For instance, defense investment would be the most applicable burden sharing indicator in this case. So here we show exactly that. We put the received EU contribution on a relative basis relative to defense investment. Setting these absolute values of the overall received EU contribution of the country in the perspective against defense investment of the country results in a more nuanced view of which countries, at least in relative terms, receives the bulk of support. Viewed from that perspective, Belgium takes a large amount of EU contributions relative to its comparatively low defense investment burden sharing. So Belgium, which received the 7th highest amount of EU contributions in absolute terms, moves to the 4th position if you look at it from a relative perspective. So in this case, it receives the EU contribution that it receives equals 2.09% of its defense investment calculated from 2016 to 2022. If you then compare that to France, on the other hand, it drops from the first place in the previous slide to the 20th position here, indicating that relative to its defense investment, they do not receive a disproportionate amount of EU contributions. Another interesting takeaway is that legal entities that are established with their head offices in Flanders seem to have an equal participation as the entities that are established in Wallonia, which is an interesting finding because even though in our mapping there are more legal entities that are mapped in Flanders, Wallonia does have a higher presence in companies that have substantial defense-related activities. So it's interesting that Flanders is, in this case, moving on top. Also, when you look at the slide, at the figure on the right side, also in terms of EU received amounts, Flanders takes way more than Wallonia and Brussels in this regard. Then lastly, a slide that is perhaps more directly relevant for the DIRS. Here you see that we mapped each project in the EDF and the precursor programs according to the DIRS domains. And then we then look at the amount that Belgium takes away within this domain. This allows to see as what the competitiveness is of these different categories or domains within the EDF of Belgium. So the DIR sets out two priority domains mainly, the maritime mine countermeasures and defense-related cyber, which we see respectively on position 5 and 11. What's also interesting is that the category for which Belgium has the highest relative position, 9.7% of EU contributions for that category are obtained by a Belgian legal entity that is in the category armored systems and related technologies, which is an assigned category for which there is currently no domain in the DIR. The reason that this insight in this case is interesting or significant is that the Belgian legal entities, as perceived from the EDF, have a strong competitive position to obtain this EU funding compared to the other legal entities of the participating countries in the EDF and its precursor programs. It must be stated, however, that this only concerns one company. So now I'll hand over to my colleague Krit, who will explain the development of the policy toolkit to legally support the defense technological industrial base.
Namely of how the identified Belgian defense and security industry may be strengthened through public measures. We are focused on state aid and public procurement in the project. I'm going to present the research outputs to you. The policy toolkit itself is based on these outputs and it's being written up, but I will give you a little taste for the toolkit at the end of the presentation. In the project, we have looked at two levels, EU level measures and national measures, however with a primary emphasis on the latter. Start by describing the EU level because it gives a context to the work we've done regarding national measures and because some important developments have taken place at EU level in the duration of the BPITS project. Quite central measure at the EU level is the European Defence Fund. It was foreseen in the 2016 European Defence Action Plan and was adopted in 2021. The European Defence Fund has a purpose of providing EU aid to collaborative R&D in the area of defence and security. As you all know, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. And shortly after, things started to move at the EU level. In March 2022, the Council met in Versailles to discuss the state of affairs and to take actions. One action was to analyze the European defence technological and industrial base, which for many years has been under-prioritized and under-financed by the member states. This action resulted in the so-called gap analysis, which was published in May 2022. It examined the defence expenditures within the EU and identified capability and industrial gaps that need to be addressed, and it also suggested how that might be done. Since then, numerous initiatives have been adopted to meet these goals and close the gaps, focusing on the most urgent needs. The most urgent needs led to the adoption of the Act in Support of Ammunition Production, the ASAP, and the European Defence Industry Reinforcement through Common Procurement Act, the EDIRPA. They're both short-term emergency response measures. Another gap the gap analysis identified was the commercialization gap in the defence sector. By commercialization gap is meant the gap between successful R&D and the investment in upscaling and sale of the product. Commercialization is risky business in a market where the first and often main buyer is the National Ministry of Defence. Closing of commercialization gaps, for example for R&D carried out with funding from the European Defence Fund, is one of the measures envisioned in the European Defence Industry Strategy from March 2024, and such a measure is also proposed in the proposed implementing regulation on a European Defence Industry Programme. The topicality of EDIS and EDIP for the BPITS project entails that we have produced two research outputs where they are described from different perspectives, but with a focus on the procurement tools, not the funding available. These developments at EU level provides background for the main focus of the BPITS project, namely what can be done nationally in Belgium to support R&D in the defence and security sector. Measures that may be taken at the national level to support R&D in the defence and security sector could be implemented in different ways under the EU rules that apply in different circumstances. I will start with state aid. State aid is public funding, and at EU level there are rules which, as a point of departure, prohibits member states from granting state aid. However, state aid that addresses market failures is compatible with the internal market. It is generally accepted that there is a market failure for investment in R&D, so-called positive externalities, entailing that too little R&D will be carried out. Therefore, there are ample possibilities for granting state aid to R&D activities in the EU rules. As one of the project outputs, we have developed a manual that describes the possibilities and conditions for granting state aid to R&D in the defence and security sector. The manual describes the possibilities under the de minimis aid regulation, under the GBAR, and under the Research, Development and Innovation Aid framework. And just very briefly, a technical thing, whenever state aid is granted, it must, as a point of departure, be notified to the European Commission. The Commission will have a look at the case and decide whether the aid is compatible with the internal market or not. However, aid granted in compliance with the conditions in the mentioned regulations, the de minimis aid regulation and the GBA, they do not have to be notified to the Commission ex ante. De minimis aid may be used for most purposes. There are, however, strict limits to the cumulative amount received per undertaking. Therefore, this type of aid may be less relevant for R&D in the defense and security sector. We show in the manual that the GBA offers many possibilities for granting aid to R&D activities in the defense sector. And I've given some examples here in the green box on the slide. It's also possible to notify aid for R&D in the defense and security sector to the Commission if the measure envisaged does not comply with the conditions of the two mentioned regulations. Here, the framework on aid for research, development and innovation stipulates the conditions that the Commission will apply to notified aid. The framework applies to the defense sector as well. The type of activities that may be supported under the framework are listed here in the purple box. Whereas it is possible to grant state aid to support R&D because the positive externalities of this activity is a market failure, there are no readily available state aid measures that support commercialization of R&D, because usually there's no market failure. As mentioned, if adopted, the EDIP funding measures will be available to close the commercialization gap. Further, it is possible to use de minimis aid to assist in closing the commercialization gap, and the GBA allows granting of aid that may support some types of commercialization measures, such as covering the cost of obtaining patents. But I'll come back to other ways in which the commercialization gap may be closed by national measures in a bit. Another route to take when it comes to state aid and other state measures for the defense and security industry is the derogation from the treaty in Article 346 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. One project output is an analysis of one of the derogations in this article, namely the derogation for production and trade in armaments. I have cited the relevant derogation here on the slide in the blue box. The purpose of this project output is to analyze if and how this derogation may be used in the current geopolitical situation to support EU or national strategic autonomy. I've provided certain findings in the paper in the white box on the slide. Here under the ultimate conclusion, which is that the conditions for relying on the treaty derogation are strict and not particularly helpful for strategic autonomy objectives. Project output regarding Article 346 has also been produced. It is a couple of case studies on the use of the derogation, covering Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands, respectively. These case studies have informed an Agoria report on the use of Article 346, which is forthcoming hopefully later this year, and where the Belgian use of Article 346 will be compared to the use of the derogation in the mentioned member states. To the public procurement rules and how they may be used to support R&D in the defense and security sector. Public procurement rules regulate the procedures for the public sector's acquisition of goods, services, and works. There's a special public procurement directive for public entities when they buy goods, services, and works related to defense and security. The first project output I want to mention considers how the procurement rules allow member states to plan combined procurement of R&D activities and procurement of the results. Discusses the different options for this combined procurement, because the combined procurement addresses the mentioned commercialization gap. Some of the discussed options are presented in the big table on the slide. In fact, the Defence and Security Procurement Directive has more permissive rules for combining R&D and procurement of the results than the general directives. It's concluded that the procurement rules provide a useful framework for supporting R&D and not least for closing the R&D commercialization gap in the defence sector. The second project output I want to mention concerns the use of Article 346 in the area of public procurement. When reading EU policy documents, both current ones and documents going back to the 90s, that concern public procurement and the defence sector, there is a general perception that Article 346, despite its narrow scope, is very widely used. In this project output, we will look closer at procurement data to see whether this perception can be verified. As a preliminary conclusion, I can reveal that we do not observe very much data concerning Article 346. This is shown in the light grey box that presents the total number of notices in the Tenders Electronic Daily database that collects all of the data regarding public procurement from the member states. Here we have both voluntary ex-ante transparency notices, contract notices, and contract award notices published in a 10-year period. And you see the numbers on the slide. In this realization, we have widened the scope of research to look at what else the data can tell us about procurement outside the procedures provided by the Defence and Security Directive. We do not have any conclusions to present on this point yet. The last output from this part of the project is more to the basic research side. It should be viewed as an exploration of whether the policy toolkit could be enriched by other than the readily available means to support the defence and security sector in the context of R&D, and also more widely. I will abstain from going into depth. I will only give you a general idea of the content. I've already mentioned the narrow scope of the derogation in Article 346. The other treaty derogations and the exceptions from the public procurement directives that are relevant in the context of defence and security, they also in different ways have limited scopes, as illustrated in this table. Last year, the Court of Justice, however, quite surprisingly, mentioned the concept of national security in judgment concerning public procurement in a way that at least indirectly related to Article 4.2 of the EU Treaty. This provision is cited here in the blue box, and as you can see, it is not worded as an exception from the treaties as such, but the Court of Justice has in a few judgments seemed to accept that it could be relied on to derogate from the treaties, at least in principle. This project output examines the role that Article 4.2 of the EU Treaty could potentially play in defence procurement, considering the interpretation that the provision has been given, in particular in data protection law. It's concluded that although Article 4.2 of the EU Treaty needs to be qualified to make sure that it does not render other derogations and exceptions without content, it could play an important role in public procurement and possibly also in other areas of EU law in the current geopolitical climate. I know that you have all been waiting for this. As promised, all of the project outputs that I have mentioned will feed into a policy toolkit that could be used as inspiration for measures to support R&D in the defence and security sector by the steering committee of the Belgian Defence Industry and Research Strategy. This flowchart is a very first attempt at collecting the research conducted in a hands-on tool, and the intention is only to give you an impression of how this quite theoretical legal work could be operationalized. can with almost certainty say that the final version will be different from the one I'm showing you now. Thank you for the attention from both Greg and me. We're happy to reply to any questions you might have.